Rachel Carson, a marine biologist and nature writer, sparked the modern environmental movement, proposed the radical notion that pesticides could be harmful to humans and the environment, introduced the concept of ecology to the public, and ultimately led directly to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. Her book, Silent Spring, changed the way Americans viewed the environment, their interactions with it, and the government's role in regulating them. Rachel Carson was born in 1907 in rural Pennsylvania and grew up surrounded by nature. She went to Pennsylvania College for Women, determined to be a writer, but switched to a biology major halfway through. She then went on to get a master's degree in zoology at Johns Hopkins University on a scholarship, which was extremely uncommon for a woman in 1932. In 1936, she became the second woman ever hired to the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries at a professional level, where she worked as an aquatic biologist for 15 years and was eventually promoted to editor-in-chief of all publications from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. During this time, she wrote several very popular books about aquatic life and won a National Book Award, a National Science Writing Prize, and a Guggenheim Grant. Two of her books, The Sea Around Us and The Edge of the Sea, raised the environmental consciousness of a generation and established Carson as a respected voice of science through her emotionally focused writing that made science more accessible to the general public. Introduced in the late 1940s, pesticides like DDT were hailed as the savior of humanity and were used widely, indiscriminately, and in massive doses by farmers everywhere. No one was very concerned by the potential health risks of these new chemicals. They seemed relatively safe compared to the arsenic that had been used in the 1920s and 30s, and no one had been killed by their normal use. Carson became concerned about the fact that many other animals besides insects were being harmed by these pesticides. She had initially wanted to write a short brief about the harms of DDT, but despite being an established New York Times best-selling author, no magazine would publish her because it was such a radical claim. She never intended to write an entire book on the harm of pesticides, but as she continued to research, it became clear that they had been grossly misused. She began to fear that humans would soon see a silent spring, in which all the birds and other animals had been killed by man-made and dispersed chemicals. So, while already suffering from the disease that would eventually kill her, Carson began writing Silent Spring. Her radical ideas were initially met with hostility from the chemical industry and outcry from the public. Many chemical companies tried to discredit her by making parodies or outright ridiculing her, but her careful research paid off and many scientists rose to her defense, including those of the President's Science Advisory Committee, who, on the orders of President John F. Kennedy, conducted a study on the issues the book raised in order to determine its validity. The findings of this committee led directly to the banning of DDT in the United States. One radical idea introduced by Rachel Carson was the idea that sometimes technological innovations are so at odds with the natural world that they need to be limited. Another concept that Silent Spring introduced was an ecological perspective on the environment. Ecology, or the idea that all organisms in an environment interact with and affect each other, was a fairly arcane term at the time, mostly because the environmental movement had been previously focused on conservation. While Carson was by no means the first to bring up the concept, Silent Spring made the word ecology and the concept of an ecological perspective familiar to the public, which led to the popularity of ecosystem-based science during the 1970s and 1980s and the continuation of this science into modern ecology. Silent Spring brought a public awareness to how humans are able to influence the environment. It also introduced the idea that harm to the environment would lead to harm to humans. Rachel Carson caused public outcry by claiming that a simple bowl of salad could be full of hidden poisons. Silent Spring was the end of the conservation movement and the beginning of the environmental movement as the public became more concerned about the next endangered species, humans. The influence of Silent Spring on the environmental movement has been compared to that of Uncle Tom's Cabin on the abolition movement and Common Sense on the American Revolution, except it had an even more radical effect. Its publication shifted the balance of power between the environment, the public, and the government. Never again would anyone be able to excuse harm to the environment for the sake of progress so easily. Rachel Carson died in 1964, 2 years after the publication of Silent Spring. However, she knew what kind of legacy her book would leave, and she foresaw how we would interact with our environment in the years to come. She said in a documentary shortly before her death, "Man's attitude toward nature is today critically important, simply because we have now acquired a fateful power to alter and destroy nature. But man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself." Rachel Carson gave birth to the modern environmental movement because she introduced the radical notion that the environment is vulnerable to the actions of humans. She also caused mass hysteria because the general public realized that if their actions influenced the environment could in turn harm them. This outcry of emotion led to the rallying of a movement as people rose up to protect what they were afraid would be destroyed by humanity. The publication of Silent Spring and the pervasive reaction that it caused led, by all accounts, directly to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, which was created explicitly for the purpose of introducing government regulations to benefit the environment. Silent Spring and the Environmental Protection Agency brought together thousands of people to fight for environmental protection. The environmental movement as we know it today would not exist without Rachel Carson.